Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Joshua chapter 9, where we read of the Gibeon deception. Joshua chapter 5, verse 1 had opened a section where it talked about how it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, they heard about how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel, before they crossed, that their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. And that actually introduced the whole section about the taking of Jericho, and not just the taking of Jericho, but also the taking of Ai. When we come to chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, it's almost as though we have a repetition, but with some changes. Notice it starts the same way. Now it came about when all the kings who were, this time it's of the Amorites, but who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland and on the coast of the Great Sea toward Lebanon, and we have a bigger group now, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. When they heard of it, what did they hear of? Well, they heard of what's now happened between chapter 5 and chapter 8. And so they hear these things, verse 2. This time, instead of just reading that their hearts melted, there was no spirit, this time we read that they gathered themselves together with one accord to fight with Joshua and with Israel. So now we're going to see a concerted resistance to the oncome of the Israelites. So chapters 6 through 8, that was that intervening section. We had the fall of Jericho. We'd had Ai both defeat, but then restoration and finally victory for Israelites. We call that the central campaign because that cut a swath right through the center of ancient Canaan. Now we're going to turn our attention to the south, and we're going to see first Gibeon. Well, Gibeon's not really in the south, but it's going to give rise to what happens next. There's going to be a deception in the case of Gibeon, and then we're going to see Jerusalem leading a coalition against the Israelites. And that's going to be the instance where we see that great event in the book of Joshua. He commands the sun and the moon to stand still, and they obey. Of course, it's a prayer, but they obey that command. So Joshua chapter 9, verse 3, when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they also acted craftily, and they set out as envoys, and took worn-out sacks on their donkeys, and wineskins worn out, and torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet, and worn out, you see a theme here, everything's worn out, everything's old, worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provisions was dry and had become crumbled. So they're deliberately making themselves look old and weathered. And so they get out, they set out from Gibeon. Now Gibeon's still in the hill country. We think we know where Gibeon is, although sometimes there's, we actually found some ruins in Gibeon where there were some pots that actually had the label Gibeon on it. Of course, it might have been imported from nearby Gibeon, but that's the best we can do right now as far as determining the location of this place. Well, chapter 9, verse 6, they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal and said to him, to the men and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a far country, now therefore make a covenant with us." And their request for a covenant, well, that almost sounds like it would send up a red flag. And we're going to see a number of these quote-unquote red flags. But they're requesting, will you make a bond with us, a covenant with us? Verse 7, the men of Israel said to the Hivites, that's who they were, "Perhaps you're living within our land." Notice there's immediate suspicion, which sends up a second red flag. How then shall we make a covenant with you? How can we make a covenant with you when we've been commissioned to drive the inhabitants out of the land, and yet you come here and you might be living in the land? So they're already suspicious of what's going on. Verse 8, but they said to Joshua, "We are your servants." And then Joshua said to them, "Who are you and where do you come from?" He doesn't know. And so he's questioning them. Again, there is obvious suspicion going on. Verse 9, they said to him, "Your servants have come from a very far country because of the fame of the Lord your God." Notice the The word for Lord is in all caps. That's the name of God. For the Lord your God, for we have heard the report of him and all that he did in Egypt. Now that had happened 40 years earlier. And all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and to Heshbon and to Og, king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. Now notice, they don't say we've heard about Jericho and Ai, because if they say that, then they're going to let it be known, well, we're a lot closer than we're pretending. So they're playing the game right. Verse 11, so our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go and meet them, and say to them, we are your servants, now then make a covenant with us. And so they're pressing for this covenant, because they know that if a covenant is made, then that's something that's going to be binding. And so they're pressing for that. That's their desire. And again, that just sounds a bit suspicious. Verse 12, continuing the explanation, this our bread was warm when we took it for our provisions out of our houses on the day that we left to come to you. But now, behold, it's dry and has become crumbled. These wineskins which we filled were new, and behold, they're torn. And these our clothes and our sandals are worn out because of the very long journey. Notice, especially the first two things that are mentioned, the bread and the wineskins. And that's rather striking to us from a New Testament perspective, when we have one who has come to us not in deception but in truth, bringing us bread and wine. And maybe that's a hint that we ought to be on the lookout for a few other parallels. Verse 14, so the men of Israel took some of their provisions, and notice the problem here, and they did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. So the Israelites, they're taking these provisions, they're taking these physical bits of evidence, and they're assuming that's enough. I can sort of go, I don't need to ask God about his opinion on this. I've got enough. I can just use common sense. I can use the evidence before my eyes. And verse 15, God made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. So notice the language, made a covenant, swore an oath. That's covenant language. They've entered a covenant, and when you enter a covenant, you're saying, if I don't keep my word, may the thing on which I swore, may it be destroyed. That's serious business. Verse 16, it came about at the end of 3 days. I said before, we have to look at the parallels. And when we see 3 days, that reminds us of something. It reminds us of someone who was hidden in the grave for 3 days. And then after having sacrificed his body and his blood, represented by the bread and the wine. And that involved in making a new covenant with us. Well, here, back in Joshua's day, it came about after 3 days, that after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were neighbors and that they were living within their land. So now the truth comes out. Verse 17, then the sons of Israel set out and came to their cities. Do you see it? On the third day. We've had this reference to the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon. Gibeon was the main city, but also there were some other surrounding cities, Chephariah and Baroth and Kiriath Jearim. Kiriath is just a word for village, but it's rather interesting that one of the disciples of Jesus is actually named Judas Ishkariot. We say Iscariot, but that just means man of Kiriath, man of the village. I'm not sure if this was the same Kiriath that was referenced here, but it's an interesting parallel. Verse 18, the sons of Israel did not strike them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Notice this was an oath that brought God's name into the very oath. They had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And the whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. You see, the leaders had entered into the oath. The whole congregation hadn't done that. The whole congregation had, and so there's a difference of opinion. What do we do about that? But they had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. So God's name has been invoked in this covenant. Verse 19, but all the leaders said to the whole congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And now we cannot touch them. This we will do to them, even let them live, so that wrath will not be upon us for the oath which we swore to them. You see, the leaders recognize that an oath is a serious business, that a covenant can't just be put aside, even after they realize, gee, I shouldn't have entered into that in the first place. And we can say, well, they shouldn't have entered into it, but now that it's done, now they're going to honor it. Verse 21, the leaders said to them, let them live. And so they became hewers of wood and drawers of water. Now that phrase, hewers of wood and drawers of water, we've actually seen that earlier in the Bible for the whole congregation, just as the leaders had spoken to them. Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 10 and 11, where Moses had spoken to the Israelites, you stand today, all of you, before the Lord your God, your chiefs, your tribes, your elders, your officers, even all the men of Israel, your little ones, your wives, and the alien who is in your camp. Notice, from the one who chops your wood to the one who draws your water. That phrase refers to the one that's not an Israelite, not necessarily, the alien who is in your camp, from the one who chops your wood. In other words, even the servant, even the slave. And these were all, we're going to see, these were all part of the covenant community, that you may enter into the covenant with the Lord your God and into his oath which the Lord your God is making with you today, with even the one who draws your water and cuts your wood, in order that he may establish you today as his people, that he may be your God, just as he spoke to you, as he spoke to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now I say that because of the parallel that we see here. You see, Rahab, back in the earlier chapters of Joshua, had heard what God had done in Egypt and east of the Jordan, and so she had cast her lot with the people of God. Now we read of Gibeon, who's heard what God has done in Egypt and east of the Jordan. That's the part they admit to. Actually, they'd probably heard of Jericho and Ai as well. It reminds us of our situation. You see, we hear the gospel and what Jesus has done on the cross. In Rahab's situation, she had despised and deceived the king of Jericho as she was casting in her lot with the spies. In the case of the Gibeonites, they hid their true identity. There's a hiding involved there too. And they deceived Joshua and the Israelites. For us, there's no hiding, but we are given a new identity when we confess our sins and we come to Christ, confessing who we really are, no longer hiding, but agreeing with God concerning our reality. In the case of Rahab, a scarlet cord is used as a sign of the covenant that the spies make with Rahab. In the case of the Gibeonites, they come showing bread and wine, and these are used as deceptive signs of the Gibeonites' identity. In other words, they're not true, but these are used as signs. And for us, we're given bread and wine as the sensible signs. That is, the signs you can see, hear, taste, and touch. You can't really hear, but bread and wine indicate our union with Christ. In the case of the Rahab, the spies return after 3 days. In the case of the Gibeonites, the deception is discovered after 3 days. In our story, Jesus rose after 3 days, and we're said to have risen with him. Well, finishing up Joshua chapter 9, verse 22, then Joshua called for them and spoke to them, saying, why have you deceived us, saying, we are very far from you when you're living within our land? Now therefore you are cursed, and you shall never cease being slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water. But notice, it's for the house of the Lord. Can I suggest that this curse was in some ways a bit of a blessing? That yes, they would be slaves in the house of God, but they would be slaves in the house of God. That they would have opportunity to get to know the God of Israel and to get to know him on a personal level, that this curse would be turned around for them and be a blessing for them, in the same way that Jesus became a curse for us, that we might be blessed in him and through him. And so he closes with this idea: you're going to be, yes, hewers of wood and drawers of water, but it will be for the house of my God. Verse 24, so they answered Joshua and said, because it was certainly told your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you, therefore we feared greatly for our lives because of you, and have done this thing. They confessed the reason why they had entered this deception. Verse 25, now behold, we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us. Isn't that what we do when we come to the Lord in faith? We cast ourselves on the mercy of God, trusting in what he has accomplished, what he has promised, but trusting ourselves to the very mercy of God. And so, verse 26, thus he did to them and delivered them from the hands of the sons of Israel, and they did not kill him. You see, the general populace of the Israelites were saying, hey, they got this promise, they got this covenant under the realm of deception, let's just do away with them, we don't need to honor it. Verse 27, but Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day, in the place which he would choose. You see, the place where the tabernacle was going to be, they didn't know where that was going to be yet. It's going to be chosen, but it hasn't been chosen yet. And yet, here's a people that will be there, front and center, to see it, to witness it, and to be affected by its promises. And so we have this contrast between Jericho versus the Gibeonites. In the case of Jericho, and this is really the rest of the story, Jericho was to be destroyed and not to be rebuilt. The Gibeonites, they were to be permitted to live. In the case of Jericho, the rest of the story, when we get to 1 Kings, we find that Hiel, the Bethelite, rebuilt Jericho. In the case of the Gibeonites, Saul actually tried to exterminate the Gibeonites. This is going to happen much later on. In the case of Jericho, he loses his firstborn and youngest sons. Now, did he give them up in sort of human sacrifice? Were these divine accidents? We don't know the details. We're not told that in 1 Kings chapter 16. But we are told in the case of the Gibeonites that after Saul tried to do that God sent a famine, and then David goes to the Lord and says, what can we do about this? And the solution is that Saul's 7 sons, now some of these are technically grandsons by now, they are given over into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they're put to death, so that Saul loses, now he's already dead, but he loses these 7 sons/grandsons to the Gibeonites because of his having broken the covenant. You don't break a covenant. Not even God breaks a covenant. And that reminds us finally, and this is our closing point, that one has made a covenant for us. Because we were covenant breakers, God sent his Son to die in our place, to be treated as a covenant breaker, so that we could be treated by God as if we had always kept the covenant. He is our Savior. He is our covenant keeper. He is our Lord.